Mr. President, do you have anything to say to the white minority in Rhodesia?
I don't know what I can say. It's very difficult what to say. We mean it when we say that we want to establish non-racial societies. The whites in Southern Africa have laid down the conditions under which they will live in Africa. And their condition is that they must dominate. And I'm saying on that condition, really, they have no future in Africa. This is a condition which inevitably puts them in confrontation with the majority of the people of Africa. But if they accept to live in Africa on the basis of equality, they ask for nothing that a human being anywhere does not ask, then there is no reason why they shouldn't live in Africa just like anybody else. A large number of them, a majority of that minority does not accept majority rule. And if we agree that majority rule is coming in any case, these people will live in any case, and therefore better that they live now than that they fight and fight and fight and live at the end of a long and terrible war. A minority will stay, and usually when this minority which stays does not ask for special guarantees, they stay as ordinary human beings.
What is your reaction to the view that white people should be given special financial and other guarantees to stay in Zimbabwe?
I think it is absurd.
Well, you were saying, has anything happened that we should talk about in the world in the last 2 weeks? And I feel like probably is the answer to that. Probably. You know
Let
what
us
I mean?
know, listeners.
Let us know. Let us know. Send us a newsletter.
Which world events would you like us to cover?
Oh, Jesus. Yeah. I was really hoping there would be more movement with your party, because I kind of enjoyed talking about it last time. It's just like a really interesting, I don't know. There are some communist groups that are starting to coalesce around emphasis on groups, definitely not like parties or anything like that, but they're starting to coalesce around the idea of, doing something with social democracy again, or trying to steer it in a certain direction. But I don't know.
Well, I had
a bit together. So
I had a bit of a dive into having a little look to see what the left was saying, by which I mean I read a few Weekly Worker articles and had a little look at Prometheus to see what any of their contributors have been saying.
It's been very good. Very, very good. Yeah.
I guess the place that I left it last week was like, does it seem like these are going to be potentially internally useful, or one, are communists going to be allowed in your party or allowed to operate openly in your party? And is it going to develop any kind of sort of like structure that might be receptive to, educating and agitating. And I think all the focus seems to be around the conference at the moment, and what kind of how that's going to be fashioned and formed. And there seems to be some criticism of how they're going to select delegates to that, and the bureaucratic solutions either being sortition, so just picking people at random, or maybe just one member, one vote, and having everybody vote on conference proposals, which some commentators on the left seem very skeptical about, and I think I agree that it's not actually very democratic. It's not that it's not democratic. And basically, I've been trying to wrestle with trying to pass out the sort of like sectarian criticisms of the developments within your party from the sort of like substantive democratic ones, because obviously, as we say, the question is, if the left of centre left, if the communist left were to join your party, like they'd be doing it as sort of a significant ideological minority. And the question is, will there be any opportunity to propagandize for something more radical? And it seems like a lot of the efforts being made to define how the conference is going to operate also seem to be an attempt to prevent or are going to lead to systems being set up that sort of stand in the way of that. Anyway, that's my your party report.
I think I read all those things that you're referencing, and I do just kind of feel like obviously people should be putting effort into organizing around it, if for no other reason than to try and do something about the like looming, very dangerous election that's, potentially not going to go a particularly good way if any like recent polls, I mean, not even recent, if any polls in the last year are to be believed, and if they hold until a general election. But especially if like the structures that are very kind of like steeped in Westminster culture and kind of like typical bourgeois political parties are maintained in your party, which the strongest factions, the ones coalesced around Corbyn, seem to be like they absolutely should be. And it's just like, come on. Come on now. It's hard to imagine it having any kind of like large scale influence, because if you're somebody that is trying to figure out who to vote for, you know what I mean? It's like you could vote for the Greens if you want ostensibly left, party. You could vote for your party. You could vote for Labour, and like it does need to be radically different. And if it's just going to be,
But I've been receiving mild propagandistic overtures to join the Green Party from people that I know, and I've been trying to concoct a sort of like an answer to why that's not what I want to do. And I'm struggling. I'm struggling because like the most likely thing that your party is going to become is something very analogous to the Green Party, and it's hard,
but maybe smaller.
Potentially smaller, but like, I find it difficult to work out how the activity within either of those parties, in all likelihood, is going to differ from one another substantially. I mean, you can make the case that your party is new and there's the opportunity to potentially influence its formation and the structures it's going to develop and the policies it's going to have. But as we were just saying, like it seems like there's going to be various different fudges that prevent that from happening. I'm struggling to find, like, other than without resorting to the most vague sort of like speculation about what kind of party we do want, and sort of like it's very hard to imagine your party becoming like a radical anti-capitalist party with a minimum maximum program that avowedly set as its aim the overcoming of capitalism. And
well,
and I don't know. Anyway,
if for nothing else, I mean, like it just having an explicitly like pro-Palestinian voice in national politics in the UK is something that's worthwhile. I mean, if for no other reason than, I don't know, getting a different narrative out there, because it doesn't seem like particularly any other party is interested in it.
It's good. I mean, they're all in small ways doing really good work, right?
Oh yeah. I mean, it is. I know exactly what you mean, though. It is hard. It is hard to explain why you should be supporting your party at the expense of other, perhaps more organized and not internally combative left alternatives. And not just be like, what, Corbyn and Sultana, you know what I mean? It's I like those two people, but then Corbyn's kind of coming across as like, a bit old fashioned, and it's hard to see if the faction coalescing around Sultana is actually going to be able to kind of like take power and run things in a bit more of a open way. But also like, hey man, I don't even live in the UK anymore, so good luck with that. That's what I'm going to say.
I guess it's my problem, I guess. Well, I think I'm just going to continue to fence it. It's my preferred location.
I mean, that's what you should always do. You know what I mean? Yeah. Especially in left debates. Just like, hey, I listen to both sides, you know what I mean? It's a thing that disgusts me. All right, let's get into it. We're talking about two essays. You know what? I was thinking about this. I have no idea what I'm going to call this episode, like actually like label it, because we did the thing again, which we haven't done for a while, where we read two essays by two different authors. And it's like, I don't know, I'll figure it out. Whatever. The impetus for this was that earlier this week, what's the date actually right now? Because we're recording it.
The 8th.
Okay. Well, as of Tuesday this week, when the episode came out, it was the 2-year anniversary of October 7th. And we figured we haven't done an episode explicitly just about Palestine yet. I mean, we've spoken about it. It's come up, blah, 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 blah. But we're going to be talking explicitly about it in the form of discussing two pretty short essays, one by Rashid Khalidi and one by Shir Hever. And it was funny because the Rashid Khalidi essay is basically classic auxiliary statements, him writing an essay summing up his famous book. So, you know, I think I got all the information. From
the 10 pages.
Yeah, exactly. But it is, I don't know. It's interesting reading these two. One of them is called, Rashid Khalidi's is Historical Landmarks in the 100 Years War in Palestine. And Shir Hever's is Shutdown Nation, the Political Economy of Self-Destruction. And Rashid Khalidi is, in his essay, kind of trying to reframe the narrative around the kind of colonial project of Israel, but specifically kind of like the ethnic cleansing of Palestinians that's been going on for over 100 years at this point, and do it in a way that, like, his thesis is that in order to talk about what's happening accurately, you have to begin from a point of talking about the actual experiences of Arabs in Palestine, of Palestinians, right? And any other way of, like, any other heuristic is going to lead you down a path of either believing false narratives, being immoral, which is obviously like the most important thing, or just, you know, misunderstanding the political economy of the ongoing occupation and, you know, the settler state of Israel in Palestine. And Shir Hever's is a little bit different. He's basically, you know, talking about why Israel is not only about to collapse, but in some ways perhaps has already collapsed. And he gives some actually kind of, it'll be interesting to kind of compare and contrast these two essays, because he gives kind of slightly different reasons for Israel not being a particularly viable project anymore than Rashid Khalidi does, which I think we can get into once we kind of like talk about these essays a bit more. But suffice it to say, the kind of thing to take away from these essays is that both authors agree that the settler colony of Israel it's doomed to fail, and it can't keep existing in its current form. And what we're seeing is like, it's kind of, you know, violent, hopefully like last, I don't know, terrible like actions as it, you know, works its way towards a violent conclusion. So not a particularly happy thing, but, you know, it's something that obviously is worth getting into why it's actually happening beyond just simple narratives that were given by the bourgeois media or just simple narratives on the left.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I enjoyed reading both of these very much. I think I'd need, I'm going to have to go back and find something longer and more substantive to see how I feel, particularly about the second essay. I think I read them in the order that you outlined there as well. So when I said the second essay, like the essay on the political economy of Israel, really compelling. Obviously find it very difficult in the face of, you know, what we've witnessed over the past 2 years to imagine Israel as a society in collapse. Obviously, I don't really have a good sense of what the internal economic or cultural situation is really and how that's being experienced inside Israel. But in terms of like sheer ability to sort of like project total horror onto the people in Gaza, and as of yet, like their ability to hold on to the backing of sort of like the sort of like West, as the first essay would kind of portray them, I suppose, they're Western colonial patrons, I guess. Israel seems to be holding on to that support so far, but like obviously a part of this prediction of Israel's doom is the prospect of they're just going too far and losing all sort of like credibility on the international stage, which, is very plausibly what's happening. Yeah. I definitely found the first essay very refreshing as well. There's sort of certain elements of that that I've definitely come across, but like putting front and center both the experience of, also rather the view of this history, having that put purely from the side of how it's experienced by Palestinians as this sort of like protracted war against their existence. It's and very deliberately intended to. He's intended to tell the story in that way to overcome certain, as you say, like other misleading narratives. I suppose the most central one being the idea that there's like two parties here, and there's an unfortunate conflict between two parties who happen to accidentally have ended up occupying one piece of land, and this sort of like historical quirk of fate that's made this untenable situation come about. And obviously the requirement to constantly remind ourselves that like Israel is a settler colonial country of like obviously not necessarily populated purely by European immigrants, but large significant portions of that sort of population has come from Western and other parts of Europe with the sort of backing of colonial regimes there. So I really did appreciate that focus on that narrative above all others in telling that story.
Yeah, and I mean, Rashid Khalidi is like a guy who, up until recently, was like a career academic, right? And that kind of, plea to like shift the narrative, these kind of things are very reminiscent of like what you get, I think, in like, post-colonial departments at universities about like, it becomes about our work needs to be about shifting the narrative, which it absolutely, of course, does. Like, especially in the United States, but also in Europe, there is just like, especially I would say up until October 7th, things have changed. Things have changed slightly, or I should actually say things have changed massively in America, but still the narratives are not particularly clear. Like the narratives in America are just like insane about like exactly like what you say, there's this idea that it is just two equal sides, unfortunately, and why can't they get along? Blah, 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 blah. Oh, these people are just doomed to fight each other. Again, it's just like a liberal interpretation of history where like events just hang in the void and they're not connected to each other through history at all. And that's just it. You just study, what's going on as opposed to like the actual history of these places. But I do think that kind of like narrative shifting kind of like idea is actually very important when you do study the history. And you do have to keep it in mind because the history of Palestine for the last 100 years has literally just been a history of the Western powers either pretending that Palestinians just don't exist or just treating them like refugees and a problem to be solved, right? Like whether that problem to be solved has its kind of violent ethnic cleansing that we've seen in the last 2 years, or in the Nakba, or in the kind of like illegal settlements, blah 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 blah, or just in the kind of different events that Rashid Khalidi uses to frame his story, whether it's like not necessarily the Balfour Declaration, but like the 1922 League of Nations mandate for Palestine, or kind of like specifically the various UN resolutions in the latter half of the 20th century. You really do just see that the narrative is just you take the settler state for granted, and then everything else comes after that. And everything else winds up being millions of people who are, at one stage forced from their homes, other stages just outright killed, imprisoned, etc. And I think it's just, this idea that Khalidi's putting forward isn't just necessary when you're studying the history of Palestine, right? Like it's necessary when you're studying any kind of history to like really center the people who are involved in these tragic events at the center of your retelling of history and your understanding and study of history. And maybe it is something that, I don't know, kind of gets lost in like big wheel teleology, Marxist kind of retellings of history, where it's like, well, first of all, you had to get your bourgeois republic, and then you had to get this in order to get something nice. It's like, when we talk about these instances in history, and like, obviously, especially the Soviet Union, like, we are talking about people, you know what I mean? So yeah, his advice, it would behoove all of us when we study history, I think, to recognize what it is that we're actually talking about.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And I mean, yeah, talking about like teleological narratives, it's like in a lot of ways, it's the sort of Israeli or the Zionist rather sort of story of this history that's the most sort of messianic, the most sort of teleological kind of thing, overlooks the historical nuances potentially, even to the point of like you could like obviously so like you're yeah, one of the things that you allude to there, and one of the important aspects of the argument that's being presented is that, like, at least the early part of this history, but most of it really in this essay is presented as being defined largely by sort of various Western documents or declarations, as you say, like the Balfour Declaration or the sort of like the setting up of the mandate post the First World War, or the sort of various partition plans or what have you. And as you say, like very intentionally centering the Jewish population, either the sort of primarily the immigrant one, the colonial one, and completely ignoring in all situations any reference to the Palestinians, sort of like either casting them as like just the inhabitants of the land, or when we develop through the decades and there's after the Nakba and after the creation of Israel, when there's this substantial refugee population, just sort of like referring to them as refugees, but not giving them a nationality or not making any particular reference to their nationhood. But it's also what's interesting is like you can imagine this 100 years as being this monolithic history, and it's interesting to partition it out into recognizing that, like, first Israel has this imperial patron in Britain, and to some extent that sort of becomes France, and eventually it sort of like becomes the United States, as like and in contrast to that, like the Palestinians in the other Arab states like ally themselves with the Soviet Union for various sort of like geopolitical reasons. So like it's important to see this history through the context of the broader global picture for one, and also an important part of that global picture is the sort of shifting who is the global hegemon at any point in time, and what do they want of sort of like Jewish settler colonial state in the Middle East. What function does it serve for them, and how does Israel kind of like interact with that and sort of morph itself and sort of foster those relations and sort of use them to further its ends, I suppose.
Yeah, and how does exactly, and how does it have to radically kind of like reshape itself in order to, maintain relevance? To Khalidi's point, in a world where its relevance is gone, like his main point, and I think this is actually a really compelling way to talk to, maybe just normal people in Western societies about Israel, is that the history of Israel is that it's the history of basically like the last major colonial conflict in the modern era. And he makes the point that like every other one of these conflicts post World War II, or just kind of like in the latter half of the 20th century, all ended with those colonial regimes being smashed. Means like, except for Israel. And so he has this kind of interesting way of viewing it, where it's just like his call to action at the end of this paper is defined by him just saying, because of that, it's a colony out of time. In I think both the metaphorical and like literal ways of saying that, like it's a state that shouldn't exist anymore because society has moved on from these just like, open and obvious settler colonial states that use apartheid and, well, in Israel's case, less so apartheid and more so just outright ethnic cleansing in order to kind of, maintain themselves. And I think when you kind of, I don't know, when you frame it like that, like to normal people, it's like, oh, right, you do have to have history involved when you talk about, large historical movements and like states in the modern era. It isn't just this idea of this conflict that has always existed and will always exist. It's these two peoples that won't get along, right? It's like,
yeah, it's a settler colonial state and it's an ethno state. Neither of those things are things which are like particularly common in the world as it stands. And that's, I mean, we've already alluded to this, I suppose, but that's the significance of the sort of like propaganda campaign that's engaged in by the state of Israel and by its Western backers, is to like hide now that sort of like settler colonial origin. It's one of the reasons why like it's so hard to so much of the narrative is around reinforcing Israel's right to exist, I suppose, because like and sort of making any question, not even questioning of that, but drawing to the fore this narrative of it being a settler colonial state, something which like the sort of doesn't exist in the world or isn't an ongoing project in the same way that it is in Israel. The extent to which now even shining a light on that narrative falls afoul of, or can be perceived as, criticism of Israel's right to exist, and as an extension of that, like, can be seen as a form of anti-Semitism in and of itself, I suppose.
yeah.
So yeah, that's interesting. It's sort of that narrative takes the historical content and context and uses it to explain the sort of like ideological narratives that are deployed by sort of ultra-nationalist Zionists in Israel and the sort of like most fervent countries that back them. So found that quite interesting.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that kind of leads us into Shir Hever's paper, who Shir Hever is like a scholar, but he was also, I think, up until recently, the head of the campaign for BDS within Israel, which sounds like a pretty thankless job.
Yes. Yeah.
But he has a different take on kind of like why it is that Israel is doomed. And it's one that I'm maybe not particularly comfortable with, but it's informed by a lot of like real materialist, I think, studies. But suffice it to say, like, we'll get into kind of his theories about that here in a second. But to give his interpretation of the history of Israel, he has this view that kind of after the 1967 war, which was over incredibly quickly, right? And Israel beat this, not conglomeration, what's the word? This kind of like allied group
Alliance.
of, of different Arabic states, and Egypt, and just Arabic states, I suppose, incredibly quickly, and was able to expand its borders. And this kind of gave rise to this ideology within Israel for the settlers that not only was it like, hey, this project's going really good, it's always going to go really good. Look at us expanding. Oh my God, this is great. We're just rolling over these people. But it also gave rise to this idea that Israel could be self-sufficient. And it wasn't until the next war was it 1975, 73, when Israel kind of got stomped, where it had to contract its borders. And it was kind of shown that not only could Israel not just obviously like expand into perpetuity, there were real limits to what it was doing, but it was also clearly, because it was a settler colony, it required a metropole to support it. And it just couldn't be self-sufficient. It couldn't make all of its weapons. It couldn't be a state like the rest of the states in the world, right? It needed to have backing, financial and just real material backing, from either the United States or Britain or, whatever other Western, military power was willing to support it. And the way that it had to do this was by creating ideologies of, oh, at first we're a bulwark against communism. You know what I mean? We're gonna stop communism in the Middle East. Not gonna happen here, buddy. And that's how it appeased, its kind of metropole backers, specifically the United States. And then within our lives, it's just been just openly anti-Islam in the form of, saying that it's like we're anti-terrorists, right? We're the ones who are against terrorism. Meanwhile, they're conducting like the most horrific acts of terrorism that the modern world has seen, right? Like it's I think the best part about Shir Hever's essay is the way that he traces the kind of ideological changes within Israel, within the settler population. And eventually we'll get onto it. He kind of talks about how now it's just like complete doomerism and people are just like, this project is not working. We're all going to leave. But specifically that shift from 1967 to the mid 70s between the two wars is a really fascinating one. And he makes an excellent point when he says that this myth of self-sufficiency that Israel had is just another version of, I suppose it not recognizing itself as what it is, which is a settler colonial state. And settler colonial states, they need a metropole. They need backing because they can never be self-sufficient, right?
Yeah, and I mean, it's a really important. It's funny that very brief turnaround. This momentary sense of like, sort of manifest destiny and sort of like, like that, as you say, that sense of maybe they could just be, because there is a point in that period of time where they start to lose some of their backing. So I think the French, who had been one of their biggest backers, sort of like withdraw some of their sort of like deliveries of arms or something, or put in place some embargoes or something. So yeah, it's that's sort of central to this overall narrative is, as you say, this sense that like Israel has been completely dependent on the backing of foreign powers, and at this present point in time, like, what is its current relationship with its foreign backers? Does it run the possibility of like losing that backing? I suppose. I really found quite interesting the sort of the overlaying of an economic and a cultural narrative to the history of Israel here, on the sort of political economy of Israel, I suppose, like, and the effort to sort of pair the two together. So like, you're right to identify these two sort of relatively close historical points in time, one of like important military victory and one of like quite shocking defeat that was only prevented by being saved by the intervention from the United States. But there is this sort of like broader sort of division of the history that's presented here into a phase of kind of like sort of like almost collectivist nation building in the early decades of the existence of the state of Israel. A conscious recognition that what they are doing is sort of like founding a settler colonial state. There isn't any kind of like grand self-deception that there's sort of something else going on, but what the author of this piece is suggesting, that there's also a sense of like restraint that comes with that. The culture was one of sort of like collective self-sacrifice in an effort to do nation building that was meant to have some kind of like collective purpose, I suppose. What's suggested in this essay is that like, and sort of I guess the political movement that came about from that was more representative of the kind of like liberal Zionism. So like, it seems like almost seems like quite
I know.
strange,
Whenever I read that,
strange,
I was like, "Oh, it's liberal Zionism." Okay, all right.
Because it's clearly still presented as it's still Zionism, right? It's still a settler colonial project to build an ethno-state, and is very consciously exploiting and suppressing a Palestinian minority. And this essay is almost suggesting that like the liberal Zionists were sort of like better at that job of suppressing the Palestinians, but the sort of liberal Zionist self-conception also says that we're better at this job because we're restrained, like we're we will only go so far. We know the boundaries of, we can sort of like push the Palestinian population into a certain place of relative deprivation, relative like political disenfranchisement, but we don't go too far. We know the boundaries, and thus it's presented as sort of like rational liberalism, sort of like enlightened.
It's
not necessarily in a
enlightened.
moral sense, but in a kind of like
realpolitik kind
it's
of sense.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's like the liberals thinking person's version of ethnic cleansing, you know what I mean? Because like, not to interrupt, but it's like when we are talking about this, we're still talking about the period of the Nakba, you know what I mean?
Yes.
So it's like
that was their project,
exactly.
Like,
yeah.
So I don't really know who's more objectionable in this story, I guess.
Yeah.
But the suggestion is, and this is an argument sort of like seemingly made by this generation of Israelis who sort of like were part of building the original state, was like the youth today, which basically means anybody like from 1973 onwards kind of thing, have developed a culture which is much more entitled. It's much more, it sort of like presumes that it is due these things, that it should have more wealth, it should accumulate more. Basically, the arguments being leveled against it by the liberal Zionists is that they're excessive, they're going too far, and this is the political movement that's sort of represented best by Benjamin Netanyahu, right? And like what the Likud party has become. And the argument here is what's overlaid here. So we've got like a cultural description of society in Israel, and there's sort of a political one as well between like sort of like liberal Zionists, and they're sort of losing the political narrative to the sort of more conservative, radical, sort of like nationalist Zionist movement. And then there's a third strand, which is an economic one, right? Which is sort of like broadly defined very similarly by like the distinction between the post-war consensus in the West versus the sort of neoliberal era. So the kind of like liberal Zionist era is defined by corporatism, and the trade unions are sort of in alliance with the state, but take up a role which is sort of like, coming back to what I was saying before, like take a very conscious role in suppressing Palestinian labor and maintaining it as a sort of like cheap labor source. Whereas the sort of latter period of the history of the political economy in Israel is sort of defined by a very rampant individualism, which is argued to be the present political economic culture and something which is contributing to its sort of potential downfall, I guess.
Yeah. Well, yeah. I mean, the way of viewing this the modern events that I'm getting kind of from these two essays is it's just an error, right? It's like capitalism is attempting to subsume a thoroughly like outdated state into its structure by, among other things, privatizing its security sector, just introducing free markets into everything, introducing free markets into the, like subordination of Palestinians to a settler colonial state, which is obviously going to have very grim consequences. But like, it's just an error. It's like you just get this idea that it's just like, that's just not possible. You can't, whereas it might have been necessary to maintain this settler colonial project by moving on from this corporate estate, exactly like what you're saying, and have a much more like thoroughly capital C capitalist structure. It just seems like it's just not possible. It's like, it's absolutely going to lead to its own destruction. You know what I mean? Mm-hmm. And I think that kind of like, you're really right to bring up that shift from a kind of like colluding of every aspect of Israeli society in this corporate estate to maintain this, apartheid structure that it had set up, that it attempted to just completely set in stone. Here's where the free Israeli lives. here's where the refugee camps are. Now that everything has been privatized, everything is like, as you say, like the cultural element of that is that everybody is just very much for themselves. Real wages fall as Intel leaves, as BDS has all of its quite laudable effects on Israeli society. Like it isn't possible for the state to spend as much money as it has to oppress Palestinians anymore. And it seems like the only question is just how many more lives is it going to take until it all just completely collapses, right? Like I've seen Shir Hever talk elsewhere about how it's really difficult to get accurate numbers of how many of Israelis have just left Palestine, right? In the 2 years since October 7th. Some sources seem to claim a lot. And it seemed like there was also some reporting pretty early on in this phase of the war that people were just being stopped from leaving, right? Other sources
is this people leaving the settlements in the West Bank, do you mean?
No, I mean just leaving Israel in general.
Oh, leaving Israel.
Just like trying to get out because the economy is collapsing and missiles continually are being lobbed at it, right? And they just want nothing to do with it. That's kind of like a nice way of ascribing their motives. But there's other reporting that's just like not many people have actually left and all those numbers are overblown. But what Shir Hever is basically saying is that you talk to anybody in Israel and people are all trying to leave, whether or not they can, right? And so that's another question where it's like, how long can this settler colony continue to exist when its settlers are just leaving, right? I mean, rightfully so. Like if you were against your wishes born into Israeli society, like it behooves you to leave, especially if you're like our age and you'd be conscripted into the military, right? Like,
yeah. And I suppose that's like it's something that's sort of, it's like a inverse effect of the narrative of a settled colonial state. Like everybody has come to Israel. I suppose all those people that are either recent immigrants or second or third generation immigrants, like identify with that narrative, but also have the knowledge that they came from somewhere else and they could potentially go somewhere else, particularly if they're like have access to means and wealth and whatever. I'm sure there are like class divisions within Israeli society that make certain people able to leave and certain people not. But yeah, if this is pure hypothesizing now. Like I don't know whether there's both like the level of cultural attachment to place, whether that's like as strong as it might be in some other places, but then also like the means and the knowledge that you can go somewhere else might be more available to a population of settler colonial immigrants than to a population of another country that might be in a similar situation, I guess.
Yeah, it's interesting because I think especially when I was reading Rashid Khalidi's essay, this idea that like this is a state out of the time that it should have existed within. This is an outdated colonial construct. It was interesting on one hand because I was like, well, what about all of the settler states that have like just instantiated themselves as permanent? You know what I mean? Like the United States, like Australia, to pick two at random. You know what I mean? Like obviously those from a completely different time, one of a different era of capitalism. But I think I was a little bit uncomfortable by just the idea where it's like, because there are no states like it, it necessarily has to go away. Like, and that's not solely the argument that Rashid Khalidi is making. It's just like, there are a million other reasons why Israel's economy can't keep functioning. But yeah, that was just in the back of my mind. It was like,
yeah. And I guess like when you say go away, we should try and put that into some kind of context, because he's very explicitly not necessarily saying that like every immigrant to the sort of like every Israeli citizen that's an immigrant to what was formerly Palestine is going to go somewhere else or leave or be displaced or some sort of like, it's more just that like the structure of this nation, this society, this polity is going to have to change quite substantially. How its political economy functions, how it sort of like differentiates between people on the basis of ethnicity or religion, how it relates to its neighbors. That basically, like, they weren't like, you've outlined some of the sort of crisis tendencies. One of the things I sort of felt was lacking from this essay a bit was like, well, I didn't get it, was like a very explicit definition of what the sort of crisis tendencies are, I suppose. But he sort of like outlines some of the symptoms of one of them being like just a total, particularly in the context of the sort of post-October 7th history of Israel, I guess, like, and how they've reacted to that has totally discounted the possibility of any regional trading bloc forming, like Israel having any meaningful relations with its neighbors economically, separate from its sort of like colonial sort of like relations, I guess, with the United States or with Europe or whatever.
I think just in terms of like crisis tendencies, it's just like a very similar thing that's happening in terms of debt to every other country on the planet, right? Mm-hmm. Most notably America at the moment, right? Where like Israel has been running a budget deficit of, depending on where you read, between like 5 and 8% for some time now of its GDP. And it's just like, that is clearly not sustainable. And despite all of this talk about, I mean, obviously, like rightfully so, about how much America supports Israel, like it has to do that indirectly. It gives it all of these weapons for free, but you can't, like, one country can't just give another country a bunch of money, you know what I mean, mm-hmm. to cover its debt. It can guarantee its debt, which America has done before in the 90s, which was kind of unprecedented. But then that all kind of just blew up because Israel was just like, well, we're actually not going to pay any of this shit back. Sorry. And America mm-hmm. was like, I think Congress pretty explicitly was like, well, we're just not going to do that again then. And short of guaranteeing its debt, like America can't just give it money. You know what I mean? It can subsidize it with all of these free weapons, but like there are also real limits to that in terms of like, I know that this will mean nothing to like the people of Palestine, but like there are real limits to the amount of weapons that America can just give to Israel, like especially when it's surrounded by not just hostile states, but like in terms of Iran, just like a state that's just like way more powerful than it. You know what I mean? Israel's power and, strength comes from its Western backing, not any inherent tendency to its economy. So like the crisis tendency would just be debt. And it would be the idea that, he touches on it briefly in this one, Shir Hever does, where it's like the political economy of self-destruction and what he calls like the shutdown nation. Israel was always supposed to be this startup nation, which is just like, oh, it's so absurd. It's so farcical. The fact that it's like, of course, this like ethno state fucking settler colony is like a hub for like
Silicon Valley on the Mediterranean.
Yeah, it's just like, that is so fucking disgusting. But and like, all of these, like privatized security groups and shit like that. It's obviously all very disgusting and very grim. But just to say, like, if that whole economy is built on promises of future value, which, hey, if you know anything about promises of future value, all it takes is like intel. Yeah. Well, yeah, exactly. It's fake. You know what I mean? Yeah. And if it can't actually attract investors, because it's like, it probably doesn't make economic sense for capitalists anymore to be investing there. Like,
I thought it was a really interesting symptom of what you were just describing that's outlined in this piece, this sort of description of like the relationship between Israel's sort of like technical industrial parts of its economy and its relationship to sort of like its military, and how it had managed to convince a lot of people to do their sort of like national service and serve in the military, because there was the possibility of serving in these quite prestigious units in the army that, I mean, presumably are flying drones or whatever, or but like you can do your national service working on some of these sort of advanced technological military apparatuses, with the promise of then leaving the army and getting some really lucrative, high-paying job in, an Israeli tech firm or military, whatever. Something.
So evil.
And like the the narrative of breakdown in this is like, well, maybe that future doesn't exist, and in that instance, like, you can't then convince people to serve in the army in this way. And I suppose coming back to that sort of like liberal Zionist sort of pre 1970 argument would have been like, well, back in our day, we'd have just done it for the for the good of the nation, and in this sort of like collectivist versus individualistic dynamic that's being presented as being the big cultural shift of the sort of like history of Israel, people sort of like are only acting in a very self-serving way now. The only reason to do conscription is to then have the opportunity to have some high-paying job later on in life. And if one thing starts to fall apart, if one thing starts to become economically or systemically unviable, it's sort of like all the pieces start to fall away, I guess, in that.
Yeah,
that example being one of those.
Yeah,
sort of
I haven't checked in
society
recently. How's the tech sector going? I mean, the line seems to be going up, so I couldn't imagine a world where it goes down.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Or maybe they'll just be replaced by AI, and then
Oh yeah, great. Yeah, I think another one of Shir Hever's like main areas of expertise is the privatization of Israeli security apparatuses. And it's a really interesting parallel to what he's talking about here about like trying to introduce markets into a, evil like settler state. Like for a long time, a big part of Israel's economy has just been telling police departments around the world and private contractors how to police a ghetto because, we have a lot of experience in managing a hostile population. So they go to the LAPD or the sheriffs or whatever, and they go, here's how you, keep people in the ghetto and make them not cross the 405 or something like that. Right. Like, yeah. And so anyway, just like, yeah,
there's room for growth there, I reckon.
I don't know. I mean, maybe that's just reached a peak. Like, all of that stuff is so expensive. And there's an interesting point in this essay too, where he talks about like capital intensive warfare, where there's become like this, prior to October 7th, I suppose, like there was so much technology, very expensive technology, and even just like machines involved in this like massive technical apparatus that polices Palestine, that like it actually gave certain sectors of the Israeli military like bargaining power for their labor because there were just fewer of them and they had to be more technically sufficient, you know what I mean? But now it's just like, now they're just running out of foot soldiers as well. And again, like what you say, why would not? A lot of people are just like, I don't want to fight. This is something that goes on all over the world. It's like, I don't want to be drafted for this country. It also, happens to not as big of a degree that it should, but it does happen in Israel as well. Yeah. But the last thing I guess to say is that Shir Hever in this kind of ends it by engaging with a series of Israeli like commentators who have all come to the conclusion that Israel can't really maintain itself, and they're kind of all coming to it from different approaches. He talks about like Yuval Harari or whatever his name is, the Sapiens guy, you know what I mean, who is like says it for very liberal reasons about like it needs to massively rework itself, otherwise it's not going to make it to its 100th, like that would be a good thing if we were to make it to its 100th anniversary. He talks about Ilan Pappé as well, but then he kind of makes the point that like all of these people, despite what they're saying accurately about Israel not being able to continue to exist for a myriad of different reasons, mostly economic and political, he says like the main reason that Israel hasn't been able to exist is because Palestinians haven't stopped fighting for their freedom in 100 years, and they won't, full stop, period. Like, and it's interesting because the way that he like fully actually ends it, like the last thing that he says in this essay is that he kind of recognizes like, I probably have some blind spots too, because like I'm a member of this settler colony. And I only hope that it doesn't come out in this essay. And it's just worth mentioning and saying that the real reason that it can't continue to exist is because people keep fighting against it, whether that's in Palestine or, anywhere else in the world. And obviously since October 7th, people around the world, there has been a large shift in terms of how Israel is perceived and how Palestine's, freedom is something that is not just worth fighting for for Palestinians' sake, as if that wasn't enough of a reason. But like, you live in a ghetto, even if you don't live in a ghetto in like, you know, in the kind of imperial West, like it's in your best interest to not have these technologies of repression and coercion exported to your neighborhood. So
yeah, I mean it's really remarkable, the sort of global Palestinian population's total refusal to sort of disavow its existence and its history. I thought it was that, and it's interesting that like he sort of he talks about there being like violent resistance to Israel, but also like the sort of non-violent cultural social resistance. I thought it was quite interesting that he sort of like put BDS in the category of like Palestinian resistance to Israel. guess I'd always sort of thought about it as being a purely Western thing. That's not to say, I suppose, that there aren't lots of Palestinians in Western countries that are sort of like champions of this movement, I guess. But yeah, something that I'm going to take away is sort of like trying to work out in what ways that can be considered like Palestinian resistance to Israeli occupation and dispossession, rather than simply a sort of like Western form of solidarity, I guess.
Yeah, absolutely. And it is, yeah, and just looking towards the future, it is, you know, if it can get past this incredibly violent, grim phase, it is interesting to try and project onto the future what it could look like. I mean, you know, one thing in the last few years, I think it probably started well before October 7th. It probably started like with Trump, honestly, is that a lot of people started to see that the two-state solution thing is just like not possible. Not possible for a lot of different reasons. Mainly because of what Rashid Khalidi is saying, is that whenever Palestine is mentioned in any kind of treaty or negotiation, it's always as refugees or as a people to be dealt with, right? They're never given, you know, even in the Balfour Declaration, when it mentions like the British government will give its utmost support to the creation of a Zionist state, and, you know, no infringement shall be made upon the religious and civil liberties of the people already living there, but says not, which first of all, fake news, but then it is also like says nothing about their like actual national rights or political rights, right? Like, I don't know. It is just interesting to see that like how much global, I think, perception of Palestine has changed in recent years, and also just like what it is that would need to be done to create a structure that is yeah, not just a violent ethno state fighting for its last gasp of existence, you know what I mean?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
We'll see.
But yeah. I don't know whether this is well. One thing to say is it's like I find it strange trying to. I mean, it's nice to be invited, I suppose, by this to try and find some grounds for hope in the context of like such horror. I think I'd just been like lost all hope in the possibility of like any other outcome. Yeah, I don't know.
Yeah. I mean, the thing is like all settler states or imperial states, like if there were to be a state solution where everybody in Palestine is given equal rights to creating the world that they want to see fit, it's like, how do you overcome the gap in wages between the, you know, Palestinian Arabs who are allowed to come in from the West Bank to work in Israel? How do you overcome the last 2 years where it seems like everybody in Israel kind of just wants you dead if you're living in Gaza or elsewhere? Like, it'd be very difficult to overcome that, and obviously not impossible, but I don't know. It is worth saying, like, you were right to bring up earlier in the episode that when I said, you know, Israel gone, it's like, well, what does that actually mean? Like, you know, Rashid Khalidi isn't talking about just deporting all of the like Jews from Palestine, obviously, for a million different reasons, not least of which that would be kind of immoral. But like, it's very difficult because, again, when we talk about the people involved in these big historical moments, we're talking about people. And, you know, I remember a few years ago, I met a guy from Israel out here, and he was talking about how, never would go back to Israel because he'd be conscripted, doesn't feel like he has a home, blah, 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 blah. And I was like, okay, yeah, well, like, welcome to the club of being from like a settler state. Like, you don't feel like you have a country. Okay, crazy, dude. But he also made a very good point where he was like, my grandma was 7 when she watched her entire family be killed at Sobibor. And someone told her they were building a socialist commune for Jews away from this continent that hates all of us and wants to see all of us dead. So she said, yeah, of course. So it's made more complicated by that. It's made more complicated by the conflation of Israel with Judaism, which of course is something that needs to be fought back against, because obviously it's blatantly not true. So yeah, I wouldn't be the first person to say this, Dan. Complicated.
Yes, certainly.
But of course, the liberation of like Palestine is not particularly complicated. It's not like liberals like to say complicated so they can stop talking about it. But it's like, no, like the state of Israel needs to be like overthrown and something like radically democratic needs to be put in its place with assurances for the safety of all of these people. Like, that part's not complicated. Let's go back to reading about the origin of capitalism or something next time. Current events. Current events. Part of this, the last thing I'll say is that part of this got me thinking about for some reason, the Robert Brenner piece that we read kind of recently, where he was just talking about like Trumpism is just like kleptocracy because there's no room for growth or whatever. And that leads to all of these kind of absurd things. And it's like, kind of got me thinking about ICE. And I was thinking about like, to what extent is this, an attempt at the liquidation of the petty bourgeoisie and a kind of like, like disciplining of the working class. Like, I'm sure it is those things, especially the latter, but like, it's also just like dudes who own apartment buildings in Chicago calling ICE and being like, hey, my tenants are being like shitty and trying to like get away with certain things. Can you just like arrest them all and deport them so I can sell this building? And it, that just reminds me very much of what's going on like with the government in Israel, where it's just like, sometimes it is just more absurd than you think. It is just rats on a sinking ship in terms of like every politician all over the world sees that there's a scramble for the last remnants of, self-accumulating value, and everyone's just trying to get the last piece of the pie, and it comes out as just outright corruption and absurdity. And obviously in Palestine, that takes the form of just mass violence, right? So
yeah, I think that's the thing that I'm going to take away from this that's most interesting to some degree, is like the interplay between the economic, the cultural, and the political. The sort of like the focus in this of this sort of like cultural narrative, and most of the output that I've seen in the media from Israel about what's going on there, internal to the country and how people are feeling, actually is just like, what shocked me the most is just how seemingly committed to this regime, and also the sort of like messianic narrative of building Israel and of the sort of like manifest destiny of this population. Now, a lot of what you've said and a lot of what this piece is about are sort of like shown there to be some cracks in that kind of thing, but it in the context of this, it almost feels like a culture of self-destruction to some extent. Like our only option to attempt to preserve our way of life is like brutal expansion, and absolutely no compromise to that system, no matter how in crisis it seems, or in decline it seems, or on the brink of whatever it seems. Yeah, and that it's a similar thing you say about the kind of like the person who owns a tenement building calling ICE on its tenants. The landlord calling ICE on its tenants. Like, where's the intersection between political interest, sort of cultural prejudice, like where there's a resort to authoritarianism to defend a sort of a more base economic self-interest, perhaps. But,
yeah, absolutely. Everything that we've read relatively recently about current events, just come away with it. Something's got to give. Something certainly has to give, because, hey, I don't know. Things clearly can't keep going on like this. I mean, clearly in this reading, it's like Israel cannot continue in this form for any longer. Hopefully that will be a good thing, depending on what comes next. You know what I mean? But Same the world over. Someone's got to give. Good thing there's like a huge like proletariat, like class conscious movement globally because it'll just take power. You know what I mean? It'll be easy. We'll just do communism.
Yeah. You know, it's the Green Party or something.
Oh, God. Yeah, exactly. I mean, it is crazy. Going back to that, it is crazy that it's like what I said at the beginning. It's like, hey, your party, at least they're like willing to acknowledge the existence of Palestinians. It's like, oh boy, it would be nice to have a much bigger step forward than that. Like, Jesus.
It's a low bar.
Yeah, exactly. Jesus. All right. Well, that was that. Thank you very much, Dan. Something obviously worth talking about. And yeah, what I would say is, yeah, listener, go brush up on your on the actual like lived history of Palestine, because you can do a lot worse than Rashid Khalidi and read in his whole book. So yeah,
put that on the list.
All right. Thank you very much, Dan. Talk to you next time.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Hey everybody, Jack here. Thank you so much for listening to this week's episode. The song that you heard on this episode is Music to Kill Bad People To by King Gizzard and the Lizard Wizard. You can go ahead and check this song out much more on their Bandcamp at kinggizzard.bandcamp.com. If you want to go ahead and get in touch with us, chat shit, tell us that we're wrong, whatever you want to do, you can go ahead and do that at auxiliarystatements@gmail.com. You can just send us a message there, or you can get in touch with us on Twitter, on Discord, on Instagram. You're a smart person. You can find these places. We got a YouTube. We post stuff there as well. Sometimes we stream. Thank you so much for listening. Till next time.